Every day, millions of gardeners walk outside with a hose or watering can and do something that ancient farmers solved over 2,000 years ago. They guess. They pour water on top of the soil, watch most of it evaporate into the air, and come back tomorrow to do it again. Meanwhile, somewhere buried in an ancient Chinese agricultural text, the first farming manual ever written, was a method so efficient that a single filling could feed plants for a week without a drop of waste. Civilizations across China, Rome, India, and the Americas all figured this out independently. Then we forgot. What you're about to learn isn't experimental. It isn't a trend. It's a permanent solution that's been waiting for you in the dirt this whole time. Let's start with the thing itself, because once you understand what an Allah actually is, the rest of this video will feel less like new information and more like remembering something you should have always known. An Allah, pronounced Oya, is an unglazed clay or terracotta pot. That's it. No moving parts, no batteries, no timer, no pressure system. Just a fired clay vessel with microscopic pores running through every inch of its walls. You bury it in the ground, you fill it with water, you walk away. That's the whole job. But here's where it gets interesting, and where most people who hear this for the first time get the wrong mental picture. They imagine the pot just slowly leaking into the soil, draining out whether the plant needs it or not. That's not what happens. What actually happens is far more elegant, and it's the reason this method has survived for over 2,000 years while every other watering technique has been replaced, upgraded, or abandoned. The Allah doesn't push water out. The soil pulls it in. When the soil around the Allah is dry, it creates what's called a soil moisture gradient, a difference in water concentration between the inside of the pot and the outside. Because nature always moves toward equilibrium, water is drawn through the porous clay walls toward the drier side. The drier the soil, the stronger the pull. The more saturated the soil, the pull stops. And so does the water movement. Think about what that means for a moment. The Allah is not on a timer. It doesn't measure the weather or check the forecast. It responds directly to the actual condition of the soil around your plant's roots in real time, continuously, with no input from you. When it rains and your soil is wet, the Allah holds its water. When your plants are actively drinking and pulling moisture from the soil, the gradient increases, and the Allah releases more. The system self-regulates based on actual plant need, not your schedule, not your guess, not the number that came printed on a seed packet. The ancient Chinese farmer who first documented this in the Fan Shengqi Shu, a text more than 2,000 years old, wasn't lucky. He was watching how nature worked and copying it. That's a level of observation most modern gardeners, buried in apps and gadgets, have completely stopped doing. The Allah is buried with its neck above the soil surface. That neck is your access point. You fill it from the top, every few days or once a week depending on your climate, and the system does the rest. There's no guesswork in the refilling either. You look at the water level in the neck, and you know exactly how much your plants consumed since you last topped it up. This is how you get out of the daily watering loop. Not by buying a more sophisticated drip timer, not by installing a smart sensor, by going back 2,000 years to technology that cost almost nothing, required no infrastructure, and has outlasted every empire that used it. The soil moisture gradient, here's something most gardeners don't know, and it changes the way you think about everything you've been doing at the hose. Plants don't need water delivered on a schedule. They need water available when they need it. Those two things are completely different, and confusing them is the source of most watering failure. Overwatered, underwatered, stressed roots, slow growth, disease, and wasted money. When you water from the top, here's what actually happens. A portion of what you pour hits the surface and evaporates almost immediately. Studies estimate that sprinklers alone lose between 30 and 50% of applied water to evaporation before it ever reaches a root. Another portion sits in the top layer of soil and encourages roots to stay shallow, reaching up for moisture instead of down. A third portion, especially in a hard water or overwatered situation, sinks below the root zone entirely and is lost to deep percolation. Gone, completely unreachable by the plant. What the plant actually uses is a fraction of what you put in. This matters financially. This matters for the health of your plants, and it matters for the amount of time you spend standing over your garden with a hose. The Allah bypasses all of that, because the Allah is buried at root depth, typically 6 to 12 inches underground. The water it delivers goes directly where the roots are. No surface evaporation, no runoff, no shallow rooting. Every milliliter that exits the Allah wall goes straight into the biological zone, where roots are actively working. And because the release rate is governed by the soil moisture gradient, the plants themselves are controlling the delivery. When a plant is photosynthesizing hard on a hot afternoon, it's pulling moisture through its roots to cool itself and drive its chemistry. That increased uptake dries the surrounding soil faster. The drier the soil, the stronger the pull on the Allah. The plant, in effect, opens its own tap when it needs it and closes it when it doesn't. What you've been doing manually, twice a day, with a watering can and a vague sense of whether the soil looks dry enough. The plant has been trying to do this automatically for its entire evolutionary history. The Allah just gives it the tool to do it. A study out of Kenya put numbers on this. Comparing Allah irrigation to standard furrow irrigation, the Allah system saved 97.1% of applied water for one crop and 97.8% for another. That's not a small efficiency gain. That's a near-complete elimination of water waste. For the home gardener, what this means is simple. You stop being the gardener who maintains the garden. You become the person who sets up the system and harvests the food. That's not a small distinction. That's the difference between a chore and a result. Zero surface evaporation. Let's talk about what happens to your water bill when the sun is out and your hose is running. Most gardeners think of watering as a straightforward transaction. Water goes in, plants use it, done. But there's a third party involved that nobody pays enough attention to. It's the sun, and it's taking a significant cut of everything you put down. Surface evaporation is the loss of water from the top layer of soil back into the air before any root can access it. In a dry, warm climate, the exact conditions where most people feel the urgent need to water, evaporation rates can be so high that a significant portion of what you apply at the surface is gone within hours. On days with direct sun, low humidity, and any wind at all, that window is even shorter. This isn't a marginal loss. The University of Arizona found that Allahs reduce water use by 30 to 50% compared to surface irrigation under normal conditions. In drier climates, with high evaporation pressure, users regularly report saving 60 to 70%. Think about that in terms of your water bill across a single growing season. If you're currently spending $100 watering a mid-sized garden across a growing season, Allah irrigation might deliver the same result for $30 to $50. Over 10 years of gardening, that's a substantial sum of money recovered not by sacrificing anything but by changing where the water goes. And it compounds, because you're not losing water to evaporation. You need to fill the Allah less frequently. You refill every 3 to 7 days, depending on your soil type, your climate, and your plants. That's one small task done quickly. Lift the lid, fill from a hose or watering can in about 30 seconds, replace the lid. The time you recover from not doing daily watering is yours to use however you want. The Allah also changes the surface condition of your soil in a way that has its own compounding benefits. Because you're not wetting the top layer of the soil repeatedly, the surface stays dry between rains. Dry surfaces don't compact the same way wet surfaces do under repeated watering. They don't crust. They maintain better soil structure, better gas exchange, and better infiltration when rainfall does come. You're not just saving water. You're improving the physical condition of your soil with every week you use the system rather than degrading it. Weed suppression without a single chemical here is something that almost nobody mentions when they talk about Allah irrigation. and it might be the most underrated benefit of the entire system. When you water from the surface, you water the whole surface. Every inch of soil within reach of your hose gets moistened. That means not just the soil around your plants, but the exposed patches between them, the edges of your beds, the pathways, the corners. Every one of those spots is now an invitation. Weed seeds are not planted. They arrive. Wind, birds, water movement, and foot traffic all carry them in. They land on your soil, and what they need to germinate is moisture at the surface. Surface watering gives them exactly that. Consistently, reliably on your schedule. Allahs don't. Because the Allah delivers water below the surface, the top layer of your soil stays dry. Weed seeds sitting on that surface don't have the moisture they need to break dormancy and sprout. They just sit there, waiting for water that doesn't come. A study in India compared weed growth in Allah-irrigated plots versus basin-irrigated plots. The difference was stark. Allah plots produced roughly 62 kilograms of weed dry weight per hectare. Basin-irrigated plots produced 465 kilograms. That's almost an 8-to-1 ratio in weed suppression, from irrigation method alone, with no herbicide, no fabric, no additional labor. Traditional farming systems have found that as much as 30% of total labor time goes to weeding. If you're maintaining a serious kitchen garden, think about how much of your time that represents. And think about how much of that time could disappear simply by changing where the water enters the soil. This has a financial dimension too. Weeds compete with your plants for nutrients, water, and light. Fewer weeds means more of what you put into the soil actually reaches your food crops. You're not just cutting labor. You're improving yields and concentrating the value of your inputs. Pair the Allah with a layer of mulch over the surface. More on that shortly, and the weed suppression effect compounds dramatically. The combination of below-surface watering and a physical barrier on top creates conditions where weeds genuinely struggle to establish. You go from fighting the garden to watching it work. Deeper roots. Most gardeners think about what's happening above the soil. The fruit, the flowers, the leaves. What's happening below the soil is where the real story lives, and conventional watering habits are quietly sabotaging it. When you water from the surface, roots follow. They grow toward where the water is. Since the water is at the surface and in the top few inches of soil, the root system stays shallow, dense near the top, and completely dependent on you showing up with the hose. The moment you miss a day, that shallow root network is exposed. Heat, drought, and dry spells hit these plants fast and hard because there's nothing reaching down to the moisture that persists deeper in the soil. Allah irrigation reverses this entirely. Because the water source is buried at root depth, 6 to 12 inches below the surface, roots are encouraged to grow toward it. They trace the moisture gradient downward and outward from the Allah, building a deeper, more extensive root architecture than surface-watered plants typically develop. Over time, plants irrigated with Allahs develop roots that reach into soil layers that retain moisture long after the surface dries out. This changes the plant's relationship with drought. A shallow-rooted plant in hot, dry weather is already stressed before you even notice the leaves wilting. A deep-rooted plant is drawing from reserves that surface conditions don't affect. It's a fundamentally different level of resilience, and it wasn't achieved by any special seed variety or soil amendment. It was achieved by changing where the water came from. This matters for perennials especially. If you're growing any plant that will be in the ground for multiple seasons, fruit bushes, herbs, edible landscaping, the root architecture it develops in its first year or two will shape its performance for the rest of its life. Setting up an Allah near a young plant and letting it build roots toward a reliable underground source is one of the highest leverage things you can do in the early stages of a planting. There's a long-term payoff here that most people don't see. A plant with deep, healthy roots is more nutrient efficient. It can access minerals from deeper soil layers. It's more resistant to pest pressure and disease because the stress response that opens plants to pathogens is less frequently triggered. It produces more consistently. It's a better plant across every metric, and the difference was made underground before it was ever visible from the surface. The microbiology bonus: there's a living ecosystem in your soil that most gardeners don't think about at all. And the way you water is either feeding it or destroying it. The soil food web is the community of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and microarthropods that break down organic matter, cycle nutrients, suppress disease, and ultimately deliver everything your plants need to grow. This community doesn't thrive in soil that swings between soaking wet and bone dry. It requires consistent moisture, not flood and drought on a daily cycle, but the kind of stable, gentle moisture that keeps the microscopic world functioning. Conventional surface watering creates cycles of excess and deficiency. You pour on a large amount of water, the top layer saturates, and then it dries out over the next 24 hours. The soil organisms in the top layer, where most biological activity happens, experience these swings constantly. In extreme cases, flooding the soil pushes out oxygen and creates anaerobic conditions that kill aerobic bacteria and harm root health. Allahs create a completely different soil environment. Because the release rate is slow, gentle, and responsive to actual soil moisture, the zone around the Allah stays in what soil scientists call field capacity, moist enough for biological activity, with air still present in the soil pores. This is the sweet spot. It's where the best root growth happens, where mycorrhizal fungi thrive, where nutrient cycling is most active. Mycorrhizal fungi in particular are worth understanding. These fungi form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots, extending their reach far beyond what the roots themselves can access. In exchange for sugars from the plant, the fungi deliver water and phosphorus from the surrounding soil. This partnership can dramatically improve a plant's nutrient efficiency and drought tolerance, but it requires consistent soil moisture to function, not the boom and bust cycle of surface watering. Plants irrigated by Allahs have been observed producing better yields in nutrient-poor soils, partly because the stable moisture environment lets the biological partnerships in the soil work the way they're supposed to. You're not just watering the plant, you're maintaining the living system that the plant depends on. This is one of those compounding advantages that doesn't show up immediately. In the first week of using Allahs, you notice you're not watering every day. In the first month, you notice the weeds aren't coming. But over a full season, you start to see something harder to explain. The plants just look more settled, more resilient, more productive than they used to. That's the soil biology returning to its natural state, undisturbed. Making your own Allah for under $5, one of the reasons this method didn't come back sooner, is that people assumed you needed to buy something special. Allahs do exist as finished products from specialty garden suppliers, and they work beautifully. But you don't need to buy one. The most widely used DIY approach requires exactly two things: two unglazed terracotta pots of the same size, and a waterproof adhesive or sealant. Take the two pots, turn one upside down, apply waterproof adhesive or aquarium sealant to the rim of both, and press them together base to base. The drain hole on the bottom pot gets sealed. A small piece of cork or clay works, and the drain hole on the top becomes your fill point. You now have a sealed, porous clay reservoir with a fill hole at the top. You can cap it with a flat stone, a cork, or a piece of terracotta to reduce evaporation from the opening. Bury it so that only the neck and fill hole are above the soil surface. Fill it with water. Done. A 7-inch diameter terracotta pot holds roughly half a gallon of water. A pair glued together gives you just under a gallon. A larger pair, 10 to 12 inches, can hold 2 to 3 gallons. That's enough water to sustain a significant area of plants for several days between fills. The cost for a pair of small terracotta pots at most garden centers or dollar stores runs between $2 and $5. The sealant, if you don't already have it, costs a few dollars more. For a small garden bed, you might install 3 or 4 of these, a total investment of $10 to $20. Compare that to a drip irrigation system, which can run into hundreds of dollars for components, installation, and the filters and pressure regulators those systems require to function properly. The Allah doesn't require pressure. It doesn't require filters. It doesn't require any infrastructure other than a hole in the ground. You can set one up in 15 minutes with tools you already have. If it cracks after several seasons, which eventually they do, you make another one. There's also the option of using whole unglazed terracotta pots as single-pot Allahs. You plug the drain hole, set the pot in the ground with only the rim exposed, and cap it from the top. This works well for container gardens, raised beds, and smaller plots. People have used Allahs in everything from a half-barrel planter to a truck bed garden. The principle scales to whatever space you're working with. The point is that there is no legitimate reason this can't be set up this weekend, in almost any garden, with materials you can buy for the cost of a coffee. The mulch multiplier Allah irrigation on its own is powerful, but there's a combination that multiplies everything the Allah does, and it's been used alongside Allahs for much of the method's 2,000-year history. Mulch, a layer of organic mulch, straw, wood chips, leaves, compost, laid over the surface of the soil between and around your plants creates a barrier that slows evaporation from the surface, moderates soil temperature, and adds organic matter as it breaks down. On its own, mulch is already one of the most impactful low-cost things you can do in a garden. But paired with Allah irrigation, the effects compound in a specific and important way. The Allah is keeping the root zone consistently moist. The mulch is sealing that moisture in from the top. You now have moisture being delivered from below at a controlled rate, and moisture being conserved from above by a physical barrier. The soil in that zone can maintain near-ideal moisture conditions, with significantly less input than either method would achieve alone. The numbers reflect this. Gardens using both Allahs and mulch typically require refilling the Allahs even less frequently, sometimes extending the fill interval from 3 days to a full week or more in moderate climates. The mulch reduces the rate at which the surrounding soil dries out, which reduces the soil moisture gradient. It drives water out of the Allah, which means the Allah releases more slowly and lasts longer between fills. Meanwhile, as the mulch breaks down, it adds organic matter to the soil. Organic matter increases the soil's water-holding capacity, so over time the soil itself becomes better at retaining moisture. You're improving the substrate around the Allah, with every passing month, making the whole system more efficient without any additional input. Weed suppression from the Allah is also significantly amplified by the mulch layer. The Allah keeps the surface dry. The mulch physically blocks light. Weed seeds that land on the surface don't get moisture from below, and they don't get light from above. The environment actively works against them at every stage of germination. This is what a well-designed system looks like. Not a collection of individual tricks, each doing one small thing, but a set of mutually reinforcing strategies, where each one makes the others work better. The ancients who used Allahs almost universally used them alongside organic surface cover, not because they read a study about it, but because they watched it work. The water bill math. Let's be concrete about the financial case, because the numbers are worth sitting with. Allahs save between 50 and 70% of water compared to hand watering, according to multiple studies and consistent reports from gardeners across different climates and soil types. The specific number depends on your starting point, your local climate, your soil type, and how efficiently you were watering before. But 50% is a conservative, well-supported estimate that applies broadly. If you're currently spending $80 a year on water for your garden, which is a reasonable figure, for a mid-sized kitchen garden in many regions, more in drier or hotter areas, an Allah system might bring that to $35 to $40. That's $40 to $50 saved per year. The system itself costs almost nothing. A set of DIY terracotta Allahs for a medium garden bed costs $20 at most. That investment pays for itself in the first year, and the olives, if stored properly over winter, to prevent freeze cracking, will last 5 to 10 years or more. Run that math over a decade. $40 per year in water savings, compounded over 10 years, adds up to $400 from a $20 upfront investment. That's not a dramatic return in absolute numbers, but it's a 20-to-1 return on investment, which is better than most things you'll buy for your garden. And that doesn't account for the indirect savings. Healthier plants waste less of your fertilizer because the stable soil environment lets nutrients stay in the root zone rather than washing through with surface irrigation. Fewer weeds mean less labor, less competition for nutrients, and better yields from what you plant. Deeper root systems mean plants survive occasional neglect or a missed refill without the stress response that reduces yields and invites disease. There's also the time value. If daily watering takes you 20 minutes, which is conservative for a garden of any size, and the Ala system reduces that to a 10-minute refill twice a week, you're recovering roughly an hour and a half of your week during the growing season. Over a 5-month growing season, that's roughly 30 hours back. What would you do with 30 hours? The financial argument for Ala irrigation is not that it makes you rich. It's that it quietly and permanently reduces one of the ongoing costs of gardening: water, time, and plant losses, in a way that accumulates over years into something meaningful. Scaling up, here's where people who try one Ala and see it work start to think bigger. And it's worth thinking through what scaling looks like, because the economics improve dramatically as you add more. A single Ala, depending on its size and your soil type, can water a radius of 18 to 36 inches from its center. A 2-gallon Ala in loamy soil covers roughly a 3-foot circle, approximately the area of a 4x4 raised bed. A larger Ala, 4 to 5 gallons, can extend that reach further, especially in looser, sandier soils that allow better lateral water movement. A 4x8 raised bed might need 2 or 3 Alas to provide even coverage for dense planting. At a cost of under $10 per Ala if you make them yourself. That's a $20 to $30 setup for a bed that previously required daily watering. For an in-ground garden with multiple beds, you can map out your planting zones and install Alas accordingly before your plants go in. Set the spacing based on your soil type, closer together in dense clay, further apart in sandy or loamy soil, and then plant around them. Your layout decisions happen once. The system then runs the garden for the season. Some growers have taken this further by connecting Alas to simple gravity-fed reservoirs. A 5-gallon bucket elevated slightly above the Alas and connected with thin tubing. The bucket slowly drip feeds into each Ala as the Alas empty, extending the fill interval from days to weeks. The Thirsty Earth system and several other commercial adaptations have done exactly this, blending the ancient principle of the Ala with a simple gravity drip to create a nearly set-and-forget system. For container gardens on patios, balconies, or rooftops, single-pot Alas in each container eliminate the daily or twice-daily watering that containers typically demand. A large container plant, a fruit tree, a citrus, a substantial herb planting that previously needed water every day in summer might need an Ala refill once every 4 to 5 days. In India, NGOs have promoted Ala systems to smallholder farmers, with field reports of 20 to 40% improvements in water use efficiency compared to sprinkler systems, with no infrastructure costs and no electricity. The same principle works at the backyard scale. The physics don't change. The benefits don't shrink. What does scale bring you? Mostly more time back and more consistent results across your whole garden rather than just one experimental corner of it. Once you understand how the Alas perform in your specific soil and climate, and that calibration happens over one season, you can design any planting around them with confidence. Surviving water scarcity, we should talk about something bigger than your water bill, because this method exists in a context that's shifting. Water is becoming a constraint in more places, and in more seasons than it used to be. Aquifer depletion, municipal restrictions during dry periods, and unpredictable rainfall patterns are no longer concerns that belong exclusively to desert regions or developing countries. Gardeners in places that used to rely on predictable summer rainfall are now managing through longer dry stretches without warning. Water use restrictions are real in more parts of the world than a decade ago. ALA irrigation sits at a very specific intersection. It's the most water-efficient passive irrigation system known. Not the most efficient with modern technology. With technology, you can do all kinds of things. The most efficient with no technology at all, using only the properties of unglazed clay and the physics of soil. The system doesn't rely on water pressure. It doesn't rely on electricity. It doesn't rely on timers, sensors, or internet connectivity. It works with a bucket of water and a hole in the ground. If you're in a situation where you need to water from a rain barrel, a hand-pumped well, or any low-pressure source, the ALA is compatible in a way that most drip systems aren't. You just pour water in the top. This is an increasingly relevant consideration for anyone thinking about food security, homesteading, or gardening, in a climate that's becoming less predictable. The systems that work when everything is fine are common. The systems that work when the grid is unreliable, when water is rationed, or when the rain doesn't come when it used to, those are rarer. The ALA is one of them. It also supports rainwater harvesting integration perfectly. A rain barrel on a downspout feeds directly into ALAs. No pressure adapter, no filter, no pump. You fill the barrel when it rains. You fill the ALAs from the barrel when the soil gets dry. You're running your entire garden off the sky, and the ALA ensures that every drop you collect is used at maximum efficiency. WaterAid and similar organizations have been scaling ALA systems in water-stressed communities, specifically because the method is local, low cost, and teachable in one afternoon. If it's good enough to anchor food security in drought-affected regions, it's good enough for your kitchen garden. Knowing this method puts you in a different position than the average gardener, not in terms of status, but in terms of actual resilience. If water is restricted in your area, you're already using a fraction of what your neighbors are using. If the tap isn't available and you're drawing from a collected source, you have a system designed for exactly that. The knowledge alone changes what's possible for you, the plants that benefit most. You could install ALAs across your entire garden tomorrow. But if you're starting out and want to see the most dramatic results first, the kind that make you build more ALAs immediately, there are specific situations where the method shines hardest. Any plant that is large, thirsty, and deeply rooted is a natural candidate. The ALA delivers water at root depth, and plants with substantial root systems are best positioned to take advantage of that. Fruit trees in their first 2 to 3 years of establishment are one of the clearest examples. Getting a young tree through the critical years when it's building its root system, without the stress of uneven watering, creates a fundamentally healthier tree than one that experiences wet-dry cycles on a surface watering schedule. Once that tree's roots are deep and established, the ALA can often be moved to assist another new planting. Leafy crops like lettuce, kale, chard, and similar vegetables perform exceptionally with ALA irrigation because they need consistent moisture to stay tender and avoid bolting. These are also crops that respond badly to wet foliage from overhead watering. They develop fungal issues more easily when leaves stay damp. Because the ALA delivers water below the surface, the leaves stay dry. Disease pressure drops and quality stays high. Cucurbits, squash, cucumbers, melons are heavy drinkers with deep root systems and specific hatred of inconsistency. Uneven watering causes blossom drop, bitter cucumbers, and hollow squash. The stable, consistent moisture from an ALA removes the variable that causes those problems. Root vegetables, carrots, beets, parsnips, turnips, respond to consistent subsurface moisture by growing straighter, more uniform, and with better flavor. Surface watering creates the wet-dry cycles that cause root vegetables to fork, crack, or grow misshapen as they chase inconsistent moisture signals. For herbs that are already established, rosemary, thyme, oregano, lavender, the olive provides a reliable baseline of moisture. Without the overwatering that kills most Mediterranean herbs, these plants want to be in dryish conditions, and the olive's self-regulating release naturally throttles back as the soil moisture increases, preventing the waterlogging that rots their roots. The one situation where olives need a supplemental strategy is with new transplants or seedlings in their first 2 to 3 weeks. Young plants don't yet have roots that have found the olive. For this short window, you water the surface normally until roots develop and migrate toward the olive's moisture zone. Once roots reach the olive, you can stop surface watering entirely. The plant has found its water source, and the relationship is established. The learning curve for olive irrigation is almost entirely in the setup. Once you've buried the pots, established your plants, and filled the olives a few times, there's very little to manage. You observe, you refill when needed. You trust the system. That's a skill that takes most gardeners several seasons to develop with conventional methods. The ability to trust that the garden is okay without constant intervention. The olive gives you that faster than anything else. So here's where this lands. You've just been walked through a method that's been used successfully across thousands of years, multiple continents, and nearly every climate type. It saves between 50 and 70% of the water you're currently using. It reduces your weeding labor by a margin that some studies put it close to eightfold. It builds deeper, more resilient root systems. It maintains the biological activity in your soil instead of disrupting it. It can be built from materials that cost $5, and it runs your garden while you're not there. The reason most people don't know this isn't because it's complicated. It's because it's old and it's quiet, and it doesn't need to be marketed because it doesn't require ongoing purchase of anything. It doesn't have a subscription. There's no app update. It's clay and soil and physics, and it's been working since before the Roman Empire. What I want you to do right now, not next season, right now, is choose 2 or 3 things from what you learned today and commit to them specifically. Not all of it, 2 or 3 things. If you do nothing else, make 1 olive this weekend. 2 terracotta pots, a tube of waterproof sealant, 30 minutes. Install it in your most demanding bed, the one that needs water most often, and watch what happens over the next 2 weeks. That single step will tell you more about this method than anything I could say. If you already water reasonably efficiently, pair the olive with a layer of mulch and extend the gap between refills. See how long the system runs before you need to intervene. Let that number surprise you. If you're planning a new planting, anything that's going to be in the ground for multiple years, install the olives before the plants go in. Let the roots find the water source from the beginning and build the architecture that will define that plant's performance for the rest of its life. The compounding starts with one olive, 1 bed, 1 season where you stop guessing and let the soil do the sensing. Ancient farmers weren't watering their gardens every day. They had crops to tend, land to manage, and lives to live. They found a way to let the earth carry some of the work. That way is still available. The clay is still porous. The soil still pulls toward equilibrium. The physics haven't changed. The only question is whether you're going to use it.